What's up, All Stars? Welcome to the School of Ireland live review session for the AP Psych free response questions. Tonight, we're going to be doing a deep dive of the article analysis question, which is the AAQ, and also the evidence-based question, also known as the EBQ. Tonight, we're going to look at the formats of each of these, and I will also be providing you with tips and tricks on how to structure your FRQ. So hopefully that you end up dominating your AP Psych test this year. One last thing we're going to look at are the 2026 changes for the FRQ. The first thing that we need to talk about is the structure of the AP Psych exams. You have 75 multiple choice questions that you are given 90 minutes to complete, and then you also have 2 free response questions where you're given 70 minutes to complete those. The multiple choice questions account for 2/3 of the exam weight, and the FRQs account for about 1/3 of the exam weight. Now, some things that you need to know regarding the FRQs here. You are going to receive 70 minutes for both. And you can move back and forth between the article analysis question and the EBQ. That's fine. But please be aware, there are no time cues. In other words, no one's going to call out, hey, you should switch over from the AAQ to the EBQ. No one's calling it out. So what the College Board suggests is that you take about 25 minutes for the AAQ and 45 minutes to knock out the EBQ. And as you'll see, or you probably know, the EBQ has 3 sources, so that's why it's going to probably take longer to read through all those and analyze those, etc. The first thing we're going to look at is the article analysis question, or the AAQ. And here's the rationale behind it, according to the College Board. The article analysis question will provide students with one summarized peer review source. Students will be expected to identify research elements, methodology, variables, and ethical guidelines, and interpret basic statistics presented in the article. Students will also be expected to explain whether the study can be generalized and how the article supports or refutes the psychological concept being explored in the study. First up, in Part A, you have to identify the research method used in the study. In Part B, you have to state the operational definition of an identified variable. In C, you are going to describe the meaning of an identified statistic. D, identify one ethical guideline described in the study. Describe one way the researchers in the study applied this ethical guideline. This is the big change for 2026. Part E, explain the extent to which the research findings may or may not be generalizable using specific and relevant evidence from the study. And lastly, explain how at least one of the research findings supports or refutes the researcher's hypothesis or main focus of the source. And as you can see, that each of these is 1 point, except for Part F, for a total of 7 points. But as we just learned, these FRQs hold a lot of weight. One FRQ is about 16% weighted of the test. So the first thing you're going to be asked to do is identify the research method used in the study. And the answer to this, or at least the structure for the answer to this, is very simple. The research method used in the study is blank. The research method used in the study is naturalistic observation, or the research method used in the study is a correlational study. Keep it simple. You don't have to explain because or why, just state it. What are your options for the types of research methods that you might encounter? This is very important, and you have to memorize these. So you have non-experimental options such as case studies, naturalistic observation, correlational studies, meta-analysis, and then you have experiments. First off are case studies. Case studies are in-depth analysis of a single person or a small group of people, and typically these individuals have some unique trait or behavior that is very rare and that you don't typically see in the general population. The classic example of this, of course, was patient HM. Patient HM had a bunch of seizures when he was little. I believe he was knocked over by a bicyclist, and the seizures just got progressively and progressively worse. And as a result, he elected to have an experimental surgery to have part of his brain removed in hopes that it would stop the seizure. So what happened during the surgery was they literally sucked part of his brain out with a straw. And guess what? The seizure stopped. However, some crazy side effects happened. As a result of the part of the brain that was sucked out, called the hippocampus, patient HM could no longer form new long-term memories. And as a result, he became the most case studied individual at the time. And we learned a lot about memory and what the brain does regarding what happened to patient HM, such as the hippocampus plays a role in the formation of long-term memories. And because he only had short-term memory, we learned that short-term memory lasts only about 10 to 30 seconds. So that's an example of a case study. Naturalistic observation is when a researcher doesn't interact with the participants. So an example of naturalistic observation might be if a researcher got permission to come into a classroom from parents in the school, they might want to look at, how are cell phones impacting students? And so they might count up the number of students who are using their phone in class. They might count up the number of times students are on their phone, or the amount of time students are on their phone, cell phone use in the classroom. Then you have correlational studies. Correlational studies examine the relationship between variables, showing how changes in one factor produce changes in another factor without the manipulation of any variables. Correlations look at relationships. Now, if you're looking at an AAQ, what might indicate that the study you're looking at is a correlational study? Well, if you see these scatter plots, it's likely that you're looking at a correlational study. Moreover, if you see an R value or a correlation coefficient, that's a likely indicator that you're looking at a correlational study. Remember, the correlation coefficient or R values depict the strength of relationship between two variables. And the farther away from zero, the R value, the stronger the relationship. So let me ask you guys this. Here's a little practice question. You have one R value, negative 0.86, and then you have the other R value, 0.5. Which of these two is stronger, has the stronger relationship? Let's go. Yes, negative 0.86 is the stronger relationship. It doesn't matter that it's negative, it's further away from zero. There are a lot of different ways you may encounter these R values on the AAQ. For example, you might see them in a chart like this, or you might see them depicted in some other format, maybe just in the middle of a paragraph. So here's a practice question, another one. Which trait here is most strongly related to career success? Yeah, it's going to be extroversion. And the reason it's extroversion is because 0.4 is the furthest away from zero and closer to 1. Another type of research method you need to know is a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is going to combine the results from multiple studies together to form a single result or conclusion. For example, let's say you want to do a meta-analysis looking at the relationship between phone use and GPA. And let's pretend there's a lot of studies that have already been completed. You're not selecting your own participants to do your own study. What you're doing is you're looking at already completed studies. And maybe this study says, hey, yeah, there is a negative correlation between phone use and GPA. Maybe someone says, hey, oh, there's no correlation between the amount of time you're on your phone and GPA. And this one says the opposite. And so what you'll do is you'll aggregate all the data and come up with a single combined result. That's how a meta-analysis works. Now let's look at an experiment. And remember, an experiment is the only type of study that can prove cause and effect. Let's take a look at this here. The experimental method is a research method in which an experiment can determine cause and effect through the manipulation of independent variables and the use of random assignment. That's how experiments can determine cause and effect. Well, what does it mean by the manipulation of the independent variable? Well, this is when the researcher makes changes in the variables that it gives to its participants. For example, in most experiments, you're going to have a control group and an experimental group. The experimental group is going to get some sort of treatment or get the manipulated variable, and the control group, on the other hand, is going to get the placebo or not receive the treatment. And so what can happen is when you have two groups, you can make a comparison to see if what you're studying has any effect. Let's look at an example here. If students drink caffeine before a test, then their test score will improve. The independent variable is the variable that the researcher is going to manipulate. And in this case, you might give a, 12-ounce can of Coke to the experimental group, and that 12-ounce can of Coke is going to have maybe 30 milligrams of caffeine in it. And then the control group is going to receive a placebo of decaffeinated Coke. And then they're going to take their test. And then you can compare the two groups to see if the caffeine had any effect, because one group had the caffeine, you manipulated that, and the other group did not. That's what that means. And the other aspect of what allows a experiment to prove cause and effect is random assignment. Random assignment is when a researcher is able to make sure that both groups, the experimental and the control group, the makeup of both groups is roughly the same. And when the makeup of both groups is roughly the same, then you can make a comparison between groups. In other words, a researcher is able to ensure that confounding and subject variables have the same chance of appearing in both the experimental and the control group, thus limiting the effects they would have if the representation of both groups was not the same. So going back to our example, if for whatever reason you didn't use random assignment, and for whatever reason you put all high IQ people into the experimental group and all low IQ individuals into the control group, you wouldn't be able to really determine the effect that caffeine had on test scores because the representation of both groups isn't the same. But if you use random assignment, maybe you can put every participant's name into a hat and then start drawing out the first 50% of names out of the hat. And that's your experimental group. And the remaining 50% is the control group. And when you use random assignment to make sure that both groups are the same or roughly the same, you can then make a comparison. Do not mix up the difference between random assignment and random sampling. Random assignment is to make sure that the makeup of both the experimental and control group are the same, and random sampling is used to gather a sample from the greater population. So don't mix those up. What are 3 factors to look for that might indicate that the AAQ study you're looking at is an experiment? Well, the first factor to look for is random assignment. If in the study it says the research used random assignment, you're probably looking at an experiment in the AAQ. The second thing you should look for is the manipulation of variables, like the examples we just talked about. And along with that, if it has an experimental and a control group, or multiple experimental groups and a control group, you are most likely looking at an experiment. Please note, these are the only 5 options you should choose from when it comes to the AAQ. I know there are different types of studies besides these. In fact, there's different types of studies that you need to know for the multiple choice section, like cross-sectional and longitudinal, but this is all you need for the AAQ. Don't answer part A with any type of answer except for the ones that you see here. Do not say that the research method is a survey. That is not one of your 5 options. And in AP Psychology, a survey is a data collection technique, not a research method. And let's try to figure out what type of research method they are using in part A. So part A, identify the research method used in the study. Let's read this. A computer randomly assigned participants to 2 groups. Participants in group 1 received a pack of multivitamins each month by mail to take 1 pill twice a day. Participants in group 2 received a pack of placebo pills in the same type of packaging as group 1 with the same instructions. And then it goes on to say some other things. Well, right here, we have 2 major indicators. We have random assignment, and then we have a control group and an experimental group. And yes, this is an experiment based off all the stuff we talked about: random assignment, control, and experimental group. So all you have to answer is the research method used in the study is an experiment. Tell me what research method you see here. A psychologist wants to conduct a study about children's behavior during Halloween. She knew that her neighbor always leaves a bowl of candy out with a sign that says, "Please take one." With that in mind, she predicts that some children will take more than one piece of candy, especially if they are masked or alone. With permission from parents in the neighborhood, she silently observes which kids take more than one piece of candy. What type of study you see here? Yes, it is naturalistic observation. So this is how you would respond to this. The research method used in the study is a naturalistic observation. So moving on to part B, state the operational definition of an identified variable. As I said earlier, all an operational definition is a detailed description of the variables, steps, and procedures of a study. And they're important, fun fact for maybe a multiple choice question, they're important because they allow researchers to replicate a study. So this is how you should structure your answer to this question. The operational definition of the identified variable is blank. In the AAQ you guys have, you're supposed to state the operational definition of executive functioning. Let's find what this operational definition is. So here we have executive functioning, and then this is how they defined it. Participants earn higher scores the more quickly they correctly identified whether the items from the second set of items were the same as or different from the original set. And here's how you would respond to this. The operational definition of executive functioning is if a person was able to identify correctly the second set of objects shown as being different or the same. Another response the College Board would take here is the operational definition is the scores on the executive functioning test. There you go. Unfortunately, there's no copy paste function to my knowledge on the College Board. I think it's called the Blue Book app that you'll take the test on. Ideally, you would just copy and paste that just to make sure you're covering your bases, but unfortunately, there's no copy paste function. So moving on to part C, describe the meaning of an identified statistic. And here are the statistics that you may encounter: mean, median, mode, range, standard deviation, percentile rank, skewness, correlation coefficients, effect size, and statistical significance. How should you format your response to this? Well, you should say the blank indicates that blank. Describe what the difference in means indicates for the immediate recall task for the multivitamin group as compared to the placebo group. So you should say the difference in means indicates that what? Well, we got to figure out what that what is by going to look at the study. Let's take a look. The way you should respond to this question is as follows. The difference in means shows or indicates that the multivitamin group had better recall than the placebo group on average. Part D, identify at least one ethical guideline applied by the researchers. Describe one way the researchers in the study applied the ethical guideline. This is what's new for 2026. College Board made a change, and this is how I would recommend responding to this. The researchers implemented this guideline, stated, and you have to pull it from memory, just a heads up, you have to pull it from memory when they did X, Y, and Z. Let's take a look at the ethical guidelines that you need to know. The first one is an institutional review board. An institutional review board will have to approve a study before the study can actually be done. They're going to look at things like, hey, is this study going to harm participants? Is it going to cause any long-term mental or physical harm? And if it is, they're going to say to the researcher, you can't do this, or you got to go make changes because that's not ethical. And then they're the ones who are going to ultimately approve the study before it can actually take place. And this is, for College Board purposes, true of human and animal research. Moreover, another ethical guideline you need to know is informed consent and informed assent. These are the same thing, except it just applies to different ages. Informed consent for adults and informed assent for minors. And there are two aspects to these that you must write down, assuming that they are mentioned in the AAQ. The two aspects are the participants agreed to participate in the study. They said, hey, I know that I'm going to study and I'm agreeing to participate. That's great. And they must also be allowed to quit. So if the answer happens to be informed consent, you would say the researchers gained informed consent from the participants because the participants agreed to be in the study and they were also allowed to quit or back out. Make sure you have both aspects there, as long as they are obviously explicitly mentioned in the study. Just watch out for this. Another thing is that researchers need to protect participants from harm, long-term harm, that is mental and physical harm. In some studies, researchers are allowed to, with consent, harm the subjects, but it's got to be minor and short term. But generally speaking, protect participants from long-term physical and mental harm. And then we have anonymity and confidentiality. Anonymity is when a researcher collects data from participants and they are not able to identify who the participants are from the data that they collect. So no personal identifiable information is collected by the researcher. And as a result, the responses can't be linked back to each participant. On the other hand, you have confidentiality. This is where the researchers know who the participants are or know something about the participants where they could identify them. And so since they know who the participants are, when they go to publish their study, they're going to keep that information confidential. An example of this might be, let's say you're doing a study with your best friend on memory. And let's say you get a really high score, and of course, your best friend gets a lower score. Well, you might not mind potentially that your name is published in the study, but your best friend who scored worse than you might feel terrible, and they're not going to want their name published in this study. So, to be safe, a researcher should keep everybody's information confidential, even if they did well or did poorly. And then lastly, the last ethical guideline that you need to know is debriefing. So researchers in psychological studies are allowed to use deception, and there's a reason behind that. And if they deceive the participants, they must debrief them at the end of the study. So those are the ethical guidelines that you need to know. Please memorize these because you're going to have to pull them from memory when applying yourself to this question on the AAQ. Now, let's look at our specific example. Can you tell me, as we read through this, what 3 ethical guidelines show up here? But they will not explicitly state words like informed consent. They will not explicitly state like protect participants from harm. So that's something you have to pull from memory and then say, hey, the researcher scanned informed consent when they got the participants to agree to be in the study, and the participants knew they could back out at any time. There are 3 options. And by the way, College Board has said that there will always be multiple ethical guidelines for you to identify, but you only have to identify one. So here's our answers. Researchers ensure that the individual participants could not be identified from the data collected. This right here, researchers ensured that the individual participants could not be identified from the data collected. That is the direct definition of anonymity. And then the second ethical guideline can be found here. And you can say the study obtained informed consent, which is when the participants agreed to be in the study, and then they could back out. And then you could find the last ethical guideline, I think the hardest of the 3 to find right here. Researchers protected participants from harm when they considered factors that might impose difficulty for participants. You don't only have to state what the ethical guideline is, you have to describe how the researchers used it in the study. Be aware of that. Explain the extent to which the research findings may or may not be generalizable using specific and relevant evidence from the study. This one is a gimme. This should be a free point, but you have to structure your response correctly. And this is how you should structure your response here. The study is or is not, choose one, is or is not generalizable to a specific larger population because X group was used in the study. You must mention a specific larger population. You cannot just say the study is generalizable because this group was used in the study. You have to mention a specific larger population. So please be aware of that. Now, where can you typically find this information? If there's a participant section, it's probably going to be in the participant section. To be accepted, participants had to be over 65 years of age if women and over 60 years of age if men. So what we can say is the study is or is not generalizable to a specific larger group because X group was used in the study. So one possible answer here is the study is generalizable to both men and women because both were used in the study. Boom, points. You could also say the study is generalizable to older adults because only because that is the only group that the researcher used in the study. You could also say the study is not generalizable to younger adults because the researchers only included older adults in the study. Any of these would score. You don't need all 3 of these. Any of these would score. I'm just giving you a few examples because this question is wide open. My recommendation is this, guys. Pick one piece of demographic information to focus on. Don't pick multiple pieces. When you pick multiple pieces, you're more likely to kind of trip yourself up. Now, warning. Do not focus on the number of participants when you make your generalizations. Well, what does this mean? Well, let's say that a researcher did a case study with one or a small group of participants. You should not say that the study can't be generalized because of the small sample size. Or you shouldn't say the study can't be generalized because the researcher used a case study. You can't say those things. Why? 2 reasons. First off, The College Board told us not to focus on the number of participants when it comes to this question on the AAQ. And secondly, and once again, this is right out of the mouth of the head of AP Psych, quote, case studies can provide valuable insights. However, their findings may not always be generalizable to larger populations. With that said, the findings could be generalizable to other individuals who share similar characteristics of the participants of the study. So another tip here is this: do not focus on the type of sampling the researchers use when it comes to the generalizability question. What does this mean? Well, let's assume that the study doesn't explicitly mention anything about random sampling in order for the researcher to obtain participants for their study. The College Board has told us that if random sampling isn't mentioned, that students should not say, quote, because it wasn't explicitly mentioned that random sampling was used, the study can't be generalized. Don't say that. That's not what the College Board is looking for on this question. Another example, if it's really clear in the AAQ that the researcher used a convenience sample instead of a random sample, you shouldn't say the study can't be generalized because the researcher used a convenience sample. And this is because, as we talked about in the Unit 0 video, again, a study with a convenience sample may not be generalizable to the population at large, but those findings might be generalizable to a smaller subset of the population who share similar characteristics. On to the last part of the AAQ, we have part F. Explain how at least one of the research findings supports or refutes the researcher's hypothesis or main focus of the source. So in our specific AAQ, it says, explain how at least one of the research findings supports or refutes the researcher's hypothesis that taking a multivitamin slows cognitive decline later in life. We need evidence that either supports or refutes this. I'm just going to summarize part of it here for you real quick, because it'll make sense in a second regarding the answer to this question. They talk about episodic memory, and as a reminder, fun fact reminder for your multiple choice portion of the test, episodic memory, what is it? Memories of what? Episodic memory are, yes, memories of specific life events or episodes. So like if you can remember your last birthday, and if you can remember going out to dinner with your family or your friends, that's an episodic memory. So in the study, they defined episodic memory as participants viewed a list of words presented one at a time and were asked to recall them immediately and then again after 15 minutes, and higher scores equaled better recall. And then the other term that you need to know regarding part F here is executive functioning. Remember, executive functions are cognitive processes that help people focus, plan, organize, etc. And the way they defined this in the study was participants compared two sets of items and identified whether items in the second set matched those in the first set, and higher scores equaled faster, more accurate responses. So again, explain how at least one of the research findings supports or refutes the researcher's hypothesis that taking a multivitamin slows cognitive decline later in life. Well, let's look at the results section of the study. So there's a lot here that we could use to respond to that question. We could use this. Compared with participants taking a placebo, participants receiving the multivitamin had significantly greater improvement in the recall task at the end of the first year. We could use what we talked about earlier with the difference in means. We can use the chart, which kind of says the same thing, except it has more data. And as you can see in the graph, that the multivitamin group had a higher average improvement on the recall test compared to the placebo group every single year after the baseline. You could use that data as well. Moreover, you could look at this. It says researchers estimate that the effect of the multivitamin intervention improved memory performance in participants in the multivitamin group by the equivalent of 3.1 years of age-related memory change as compared to participants in the placebo group. There's data you could use there. Also, researchers found that executive functioning was not significantly impacted by taking a multivitamin. So to summarize this data right here, it means that the multivitamin improved memory performance by 3.1 years compared to the placebo group. And at the same time, this is important, however, the multivitamin didn't have a significant impact on executive functioning. That was a lot. Well, let's go back to answering this question. Explain how at least one of the research findings supports or refutes the hypothesis about taking a multivitamin, and taking a multivitamin slows cognitive decline later in life. Here's how you should structure your responses. Restate the main idea or the hypothesis from part F. Is supported or refuted? Choose one. Choose one. Is supported or refuted because the study shows, and then provide evidence to back up your claim here. How can you earn 2 points on this question? You can say the response must use a specific result from the study to explain how the results support or refute the psychological concept or hypothesis presented in the question. Moreover, the results that you have must be accurately interpreted. So here are examples that earn 2 points. The idea that taking a multivitamin slows cognitive decline in later life is supported because the study shows that older adults can delay some cognitive decline in life if they take a multivitamin because it seems to improve episodic memory, but not executive functioning. That would score. You could also say the study shows that taking a multivitamin does not totally prevent cognitive decline in old age because executive functioning is not significantly improved by taking one. Both of those would get you a full 2 points. Here's the criteria that would only earn you 1 point. The answer uses the results of the study, but does not explain how the psychological concept or hypothesis is supported or refuted. Or the answer explains the psychological concept or hypothesis is supported or refuted, but does not use any results from the study. Moreover, the response proposes that the evidence alone is sufficient to demonstrate it that taking a multivitamin slows cognitive decline in later life without any additional explanation, or the response uses at least one of the research findings to explain how taking a multivitamin slows cognitive decline later in life. However, the interpretation of the results of the study indicates some inaccuracies. Therefore, here are some examples that would score 1 point. You guys can read these on your own. I'll leave them up here for about 10 seconds. You can pause it, go back, watch it later. I'm not just going to read those to you, but these would all score 1 point based off what we talked about on the last slide. And then you'll earn 0 points if your answer does not accurately explain how the results of the study support or refute the psychological concept or hypothesis presented in the question. Let's move on to talk about the evidence-based question. The evidence-based question will provide students with 3 summarized peer-reviewed sources on a common topic. Students will be expected to propose a claim about the topic and use evidence from the sources and topics they have learned in AP Psych, as well as reasoning about the evidence to support the claim. So the first thing you should do, All-Stars, when you look at the EBQ is not read the sources. Do not go right to the sources and start reading them. You should look at the focal issue that is attached to part A of the EBQ. And the focal issue will say something like, using the sources provided, develop and justify an argument about whatever the focal issue is for that specific EBQ. That's what you should look at first before you start reading the sources so that you can make your claim and find evidence to back up that claim. Now, for the EBQs that you guys have access to, here's the focal issue for our specific EBQ. Using the sources provided, develop and justify an argument about the best time for school to start for students in grades 6 to 12. So we have to make a claim about this based on the evidence in the sources. So the first thing you're going to have to do in part A is make a claim. And this claim in this example is going to be about school start times. Then you have to find 2 pieces of evidence from 2 separate sources that support your claim. And then you have an explanation and application, which says the response correctly interprets the evidence and applies a psychological perspective, theory, concept, or research finding from the curriculum correctly. And as you can see here, the EBQ is scored out of 7 points, 1 point for the claim, 1 point for each piece of evidence, and 2 points for each explanation and application. And again, the EBQ holds a lot of weight. It's about 16% of the test. So missing any of these can be detrimental to your AP Psych score. So let's make sure we can try to get all of these points as possible. As I said, look at the focal issue first. That's the first thing you have to look at when analyzing your EBQ. Using the sources provided, develop and justify an argument about the best time for school to start for students in grades 6 to 12. And part A says, propose a specific and defensible claim based in psychological science that responds to the question. So here's our claim. You kind of have two general options here. When you make your claim, your response or claim proposes it must propose a specific effect or a positive or negative effect on the question, or the response proposes a recommendation for the application of the question. Those are your options when making a claim. And we need to make a claim about the best time for schools to start based off the evidence in the sources. And if you read the sources, I believe it's source 1 and source 3, both indicate that school start times should be later. So here's a claim we can make regarding the idea that school start times should be later. Schools for secondary students should start later in the day because doing so will boost GPAs. Boom, that's a claim, and then you can back that up with evidence. Other examples of claims that might score are secondary school students should start school at 9 a.m. instead of 8 because students' grades will improve. Again, indicating school should start later. It would be better if secondary students started 2 hours later than elementary school students because it will lead to greater academic performance. All of these would score for a claim, and I'm just kind of showing you different variations of the same thing. You could also argue the opposite. You could also say, to earn a point for the claim, school for secondary students should start before 8, implying an earlier start time. You can make a claim about the opposite, but if you make the opposite claim, make sure there is evidence in the sources, at least 2 pieces of evidence in 2 different sources that will back up that claim. Another thing to watch out for, College Board likes to do this a lot. They like to have multiple sources, obviously, but in those sources, they might make a statement that's, supports a thing. And then in the next source, they might make a statement that goes against the thing. And so these sources have kind of opposite arguments sometimes, and you have to watch out for that because they kind of maybe intentionally or unintentionally will trip you up by having opposite claims made in each of the research findings. And the other thing is you might be able to take the middle ground depending on the EBQ. If you take the middle ground, which I don't necessarily always suggest, it might be the only option sometimes, but if you take the middle ground, once again, just make sure there's enough evidence to back up the middle ground claim, and make sure if you take the middle ground that your first piece of evidence supports the one side and the second piece of evidence from the other source supports the other side when you take the middle ground, if you are to take the middle ground. My recommendation to you here, guys, is when you make your claim, just take the path of least resistance, and that is the path that's going to have the most pieces of evidence that's going to be able to support your claim. Moving on to B1, support your claim using at least one piece of specific and relevant evidence from one of the sources. When you provide your evidence for B1, you must cite that evidence with the source number, source 1, 2, or 3, not A, B, or C. You must properly cite the evidence with the source number. Now, the College Board has provided examples of citation formats. It doesn't have to be this exactly, but there are examples of citation formats. Also for B1, your answer to B1 doesn't have to be super long. A lot of students I see will write like a paragraph on this when in reality, you can probably get away with, in a lot of cases, not every case, 1 to 2 sentences of evidence. And you're not citing all the evidence from a study. You need just one piece of evidence from one study for B1 and one piece of evidence from another study for C1. So B1, you can earn 1 point for, and to earn 1 point, your answer uses one piece of correctly cited specific and relevant evidence from one of the sources to support the claim. So here's an example. Secondary school start time should be 9 a.m. because 28% of students reported falling asleep in school at least once a week. Source 3, there's my citation. This supports my claim, assuming my claim is that secondary school start time should be later. For B2, this is the explanation and application. Explain how the evidence from B1 supports your claim using a psychological perspective, theory, concept, or research finding from AP Psychology. Heads up, when you respond to the EBQ, you're going to receive 3 text boxes, part A, part B1 and B2, and part C1 and C2. So just a heads up, B1 and B2 are in the same text box, and later on, C1 and C2 are in the same text box. So don't miss answering like B2 thinking there should be another text box. What I recommend, what I would do is answer B1 first. You don't have to label it B1, B2. Answer B1 first, and then start a whole new paragraph to answer B2. That's what I would do. Split it up into two separate paragraphs. It'll be easier for you to see when you're proofreading, and at the same time, it will be easier for your grader. And it's always good to have a happy grader. Here's the sentence starter for B2 and C2. This evidence supports my claim that, and then you restate your claim because. This evidence supports my claim that school start time should be later because. Well, you go on after the sentence starter to say, this evidence supports my claim that school start time should be later. And then you explain how the evidence supports your claim. You got to explain it. And then number two, you must incorporate and apply a AP Psych term within that explanation. So what earns you 0 points? The response does not accurately interpret the evidence. The response identifies evidence without explanation of how it relates to the claim. And the response provides opinions with no reference to the sources provided. That's 0 points. Don't aim for that. And to get a point, the responses correctly interpret the evidence in supporting the claim, but does not apply a psych term or theory. For example, this is only 1 point. You can earn 2 points here. 1 point, the evidence supports the claim of starting school later, 9 instead of 8 a.m., because some high school students have to take care of their younger siblings after school. That explains how the evidence supports the claim, but where's your psych term? Or the evidence supports the claim of starting school later at 9 instead of 8 because it will allow students to have 1 more hour of sleep. Again, great explanation of how the evidence supports your claim, but where in the world is your psych term? So what we said for B1 earlier as a refresher is secondary school start time should be 9 because 28% of students reported falling asleep at school at least once a week, source 3. And here's how we're going to earn 2 points explaining how that supports our claim. Our response correctly interprets the evidence and applies a psychological perspective, theory, concept, or research finding correctly. This evidence supports the claim of starting school later. We're restating our claim 9 instead of 8 a.m. because it will allow students to have 1 more hour of sleep, potentially reducing the number of times they fall asleep in school. And when students have an adequate amount of sleep, their ability to consolidate and retrieve memory is better, thus positively affecting their learning. So again, we restated our claim. Here. We explained how the evidence supported our claim, and there is our application of our psych term. Earn 2 points on that, guys. You got it. The hardest part, honestly, is pulling a psych term from memory. These psych terms must be pulled from memory. You cannot use a psych term that is identified in any of the sources as your key concept for B2 and C2. Just a heads up on that. And then C1 and C2 repeat the same thing, except it must be a different source. So for C1, support your claim using an additional piece of specific and relevant evidence from a different source than the one that was used in B1. So earlier, I think we pulled from source 3. Here we're pulling from source 1. According to source 1, students earn higher GPAs when schools move to later start times. That's a great piece of evidence that supports our claim that school start time should be later. Now, let's explain and apply a psych term to this. So C2 says, explain how the evidence from part C1 supports your claim using a different psych perspective, theory, concept, or research finding learned in AP Psych than the one used in B2. Here we go. This evidence supports my claim that it's better to start school later because later start times allow students to get more sleep, which enhances executive functions such as attention, planning, and problem solving. Sleep is crucial for these processes, and insufficient sleep can impair executive functioning, making it difficult for students to concentrate and retain info. By allowing for more sleep, later start times improve students' executive function, which is reflected in the higher academic performance GPA observed in the study. Please do not use any psych concept or psych terms mentioned in B2 and C2. The College Board will not allow that to score. And then moreover, in general, stay away from research methods terms for B2 and C2. They don't want you to be like, oh, there was a correlation. So you're looking at a scatter plot and you're like, oh, my key term is a correlational study. No, that's not what they're looking for. They want terms specifically from units 1 through 5, not from unit 0 research methods. So don't use research methods term. And then the other thing that I want to mention is watch out if you want to use one of the approaches or perspectives of psychology, such as like the bio approach or the psychodynamic approach, the humanistic approach. Watch out if you want to use those things, the behavioral approach, because the College Board said that most of those answers kind of struggled to score last year because the application regarding those different approaches wasn't concrete enough. So I would be wary of using the approaches to try to score here. I would use a specific type psych term, generally speaking. Now, can you use them? Sure, but just be careful using those terms. I just want to thank you guys so much for watching. You guys are all stars. I'll catch you later.